The Meeples Miniatures Podcast is sponsored by Two Fat Lardies and Coat Dance Paints, and also by the generous donations of you, the listener. Thank you to everyone for your support. The Meeples Miniatures Podcast, episode 118, Deadzone, with guest Jake Thornton. This show was recorded between the 17th of November and the 14th of December 2013. Hello and welcome finally to episode 118 of the Meeples and Miniatures Podcast with me, your host Neil Shook. I say finally as if you've been following my blog, Twitter feeds and a couple of comments on Facebook over the last few weeks, you'll know that this episode has taken, shall we say, somewhat longer to put together than what I first anticipated. Actually, probably best part of 2 or 3 weeks longer than I originally anticipated. As I first said, I recorded the interview with Jake on the 17th of November. Now, simply because of the way I was working at the time, I was actually staying in a hotel in Durham, and so it was recorded on Skype, and obviously using the hotel's internet, which, as it turned out, was probably not the best thing in the world. It was a little bit speed challenged, and the resulting conversation was interesting. We didn't lose the connection very often, but some of the call quality is very mixed, and I don't think I've ever dealt with so much issues with lag and distortion and other bits and pieces. So essentially, the editing of this particular show has been something of a nightmare, and that's without having to put all my other extra bits on. So I must admit, for my extra bits, I'm kind of trying to keep editing down to a minimum, because it's taken me so long to do the other stuff, and I really want to try and get this out before Christmas. Anyway, we're on the last stretch now, so hopefully by the time you hear this, we'll have something of a coherent programme of somewhere around about 2 hours long. The main part of which I am talking to Jake Thornton about Deadzone, which is the latest offering from Mantic. You may well remember the Kickstarter project from early in the year. I know I was talking to Jake about it at Salute. But this time I'm going to be going into a lot more detailed conversation about game design, game mechanics, and even right down to talking about some of the nitty-gritty to do with things like line of sight and why suppression fire works the way it works and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of that involved inside of the conversation that we have for about an hour and a half. And of course the other thing to note, when we recorded this conversation, the Kickstarter project hadn't started shipping. Since then, the Kickstarter project has been shipping, and indeed, I actually received mine probably in the very first wave of stuff that was shipped out. So I've had a chance to kind of open the box and get things out. So once we've heard the interview, I'll give my first impressions of what you actually get in the box. I think it's quite apparent as you listen to the interview, because I did play the game when they issued all the beta test rules, and I really like it. But I just want to give my first impressions of the final product as it's been delivered. So that will be coming after the interview itself. However, before then, we've got a couple of things just to round up. First off, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Frank Reynolds, who very kindly sent in a donation for the podcast. Many thanks to you, Frank. And thank you to everybody who's donated to the show over the year. I know this year the show has had some sponsors and therefore a bit of advertising revenue and stuff, but it all helps to pay the hosting fees, and also enables me to be able to pick up stuff to look at, to review. A thank you to everybody who's helped support the show over the past 12 months, but especially to Frank, as he was the latest person to actually make a donation. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Landowner UK, who left a review recently on iTunes for the podcast. Thanks for doing that, and thank you to everybody who's taken the trouble again to review the show over the past year. And if you feel you want to add a review to iTunes or what have you, please feel free. And even if it's a case of you have some constructive criticism you want to put into the show, or some comments to make, or what have you, whether it's on the blog or to me personally via email, I always love to hear from you. And whilst I may not get back to you immediately, I promise I will reply to you, although it may not be for a couple of days or so. Now, the last thing we have to sort out is that, if you may remember, a couple of shows ago, we had Jake on the show and we were talking about God of Battles. And as part of that show, we put up a competition to win a signed copy of God of Battles, signed by Jake himself. And I asked you, I got Jake to ask you a very simple question, which was actually something that we talked about in the realm of the podcast, and that was, how many races of owls were there in God of Battles? And I had literally tens of entries. It's been probably one of my most popular competitions. So, having gathered all the correct competition entries together, and believe it or not, there were a couple of people who got it wrong. Remember, just because the godless aren't called elves doesn't mean to say they're not elves. I think that's where a couple of people went wrong. Never mind. Anyway, having gathered all the entries together, I've randomly chosen one, and the lucky winner is Philip Hesketh. Many congratulations, Philip. Well done. There'll be a copy of God of Battles coming to you very shortly. However, I do need to know your address, so please email me with your address, and I'll get that off to you ASAP. And finally, I wanted to give a shout out to a couple of podcast listeners, Paul O'Grady and Alan Dern. Now, Paul and Alan are a couple of guys from Australia, and you may remember last year Alan came up with the Meeples Miniatures drinking game, which, if you'd listened to the average episode of Meeples Miniatures, would have had you half smashed by the time you got, I don't know, about 5 minutes in, I think. Anyway, Paul has since come up with a new game to play whilst listening to the Meeples and Miniatures podcast, and that is called Meeples and Miniatures Bingo. Now, the only other two bingo games I've come across in this sort of thing before were either Bullshit Bingo, which was a game that a friend of mine bought me as a joke one year, and it's basically all about how to play management speak bingo during meetings. And the second one is Boycott Bingo, which you may have heard of if you're a regular listener to Test Match Special. I'm a huge cricket fan, and so as a regular TMS listener, hearing words like a corridor of uncertainty, and my mother could catch that in her pinny, etc., etc., from Mr. Jeff Boycott, is always a bit of a giggle. However, Alan and Paul have now come up with a similar sort of game related to my podcast. I'm flattered, I think. I'll put a link in the show notes, although I have actually posted a link before on the blog. So try it out the next time you listen to a Meeples Miniatures show, and let me know just how far you get in before you yell bingo. Okay? Thanks again, guys. Okay, we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be chatting with Jake Thornton all about Deadzone.
The eagles have gone. Britain lies defenseless in a cruel world. Since the birth of our Lord, it has been 456 years. What sins have we committed to bring this punishment to Britain? I speak, of course, of the Saxons. They came as allies, but now they seek conquest. The lands of the Britons lie ravaged before them. Blood runs red in our island. We need a leader to stand against them. We need a man to bring together the Britons in common cause. We seek a Dux Britanniarum.
Right, that's enough of that. Dux Britanniarum from Two Fat Lardies. They really are very good.
Well, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the Meeples Miniatures show, Jake Thornton. Welcome, Jake.
Hello, Neil.
Welcome back to for yet another chat. Obviously, a glutton for punishment. And tonight we're talking about. We're recording this on the 18th of November. We are talking about the now imminent release of a game you designed. I suppose it's 6. I mean, we'll find out how long you've been working on it, but certainly it's been a good 6 months or so since the Kickstarter. No, it's been longer than that. It was April, wasn't it? Because it was Salute time.
So, yes.
Yes. Anyway, we're talking about Deadzone.
Yeah, indeed. The last thing I heard was that almost everything has arrived in the factory to put together, but they're just waiting on the buildings, which obviously are quite an important bit, so they can't quite pack them yet. But I think the factory's sort of squeaking at the edges because it's so full of stuff that needs to get packed together. But you can't kind of half pack something. You've got to wait till you've got everything and then do it all at once.
I seem to remember seeing photos of people trying out the new deluxe mats by spreading them out. Yes, spreading them out on the floor and using them as a mattress.
Well, I think they're just sort of seeing whether they all join neatly, and I think they put 6 or 8 together, and it all fits nicely and so on. I pinched one actually. I've got it, and they've done a nice job on the sort of putting the corners where the original test one we had were rounded, because that's just what they do with mouse mats. And we said, well, we don't really want them rounded, but at the same time, if you have them cut perfectly square, then they get ratty and damaged. So they've cut a very small, tiny little round on it, which just does the job of protecting it without causing a big hole in your game when you put several together.
That's good. So I take it it's a similar sort of mat to what we've seen with the Dreadmaul Ultimate pitch.
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same stuff. It's the same kind of mouse mat technology, but with its different artwork on it. It's a different size and shape, but it's the same stuff. Which is rather bizarre things. I'm always endlessly kind of intrigued by the fact you just crumple it up into a pile and stuff it in a bag, and then just tip it onto the table, and it sort of flops out and is fine and uncreased. I don't know quite how they manage that, but the fact that you can't. I mean, I've not actually tried destructive testing one of them, but they're slightly stretchy. They don't seem to crease. They they don't. I'm sure tearing them is possible. But you have to try really hard. I mean, they're actually quite a good thing to make gaming boards out of. I've not seen them anywhere else, but I'm sure someone must have tried it. It seems to be quite a nifty idea.
And I mean, at this point, some people might kind of wonder what the heck we're talking about. Well, why are you making game boards out of mouse mats? And I assure you, all will become or may become clear in as we talk. But so let's go back and talk about the rules. I mean, we did kind of cover this just in passing when I spoke to you at Salute. So some people may, if you missed the Kickstarter, you may kind of have a little bit of an inkling about what Deadzone is all about. But Jake, would you care to kind of just give an overview of what Deadzone is?
An overview? To my ears and details at the moment, so stepping back for an overview is always a challenge, actually. Deadzone is a science fiction skirmish game set in Mantic's Warpath universe. It's the idea is to take the Warpath universe is Mantic's science fiction universe, and they've got a mass battle game which is called Warpath, and Dreadball is also set in that same universe. And obviously, as a sports game, it looks at a very different aspect of that universe. And Deadzone is another way of looking at the same background, but looking at, again, another little different aspect of that. And so it focuses on sort of special units and elite special forces, kind of very small actions. And it's set in the name Deadzone comes from the idea that the corporation, the main human empire, as it were, when things happen that they don't like, that they don't really want to have to deal publicly with, they lock down the area. They basically remove it from the maps in what's called a containment protocol. At least it's called containment protocol officially, but what everybody else calls it is it's called a dead zone. It's where you can't get in or out. The problem is whether this is a rebellion by aliens, insurrection by disaffected mercenaries, outbreaks of alien infestations or plagues, whatever it might be, they just lock it down and bar the doors basically and send in the troops to sort it out. And when everything is fixed, which may be years later, then back it appears on the maps, everything's all fine again. But it means that the powers that be don't have to actually deal with anything unpleasant in the press. But this is a setting where it's something where problems happened, and they've sent in forces, basically the forces of the elite of the Council of Seven, who are the people who rule the corporation.
Yeah.
And in this particular iteration, we've got an outbreak of plague, which is an alien mutagen that mutates people and creatures and into these great sort of monstrous creatures that then go around tearing people into small bits and infecting more of them and creating more monsters to go and do it again. So they've got to the enforcers. The big general backstory is that the enforcers are going in to fix this problem, which mainly means wiping out all of the plague. But while they're doing this, because the place has been locked down and is now no longer officially part of the corporation, it's all, nobody talks about this place anymore. Everybody else, all the other factions, know what's going on, and they look at this as a source of technology, of resources, of stuff they can go in and nick, because no one's really paying attention at the moment. It's not really part of the empire. It's not like you're invading the empire, the corporation as such. Got all Star Wars on me. I was thinking about Rebels. So. Sorry.
It's an easy thing to do. Yeah.
It's not, because we have got rebels, and the rebels are who don't like the corporation are never very well supplied or funded or whatever. And so the ability to go into this to the dead zone and to basically ransack whatever they want. And the people who are there are obviously dealing with the plague or whatever other problem might be happening at the same time, and they can't call for help from outside because that's been blocked. So it's much easier pickings than it will be going to do this in a normal part of the corporation. And so you consequently get lots of different factions coming in to take their slice of the pie. Meanwhile, the plague are busy rampaging around and the enforcers are trying to stop them. So it gets a bit kind of fractious, shall we say. There's lots of different people out to do different things. So that's the setting in which we put this skirmish game, because obviously there's lots of skirmishes going on all over the place. Broad strokes of how it works in theory without going into the rules specifically.
Okay. Plenty of time to do that. Yeah, okay. So obviously people will be familiar with this style of game. I mean, effectively, it's a gang-type skirmish. So whether you're familiar with things like Necromunda, or whether something like Infinity, or Malifaux, or that sort of ilk of game, it's that similar sort of style, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you would be unlikely to have more than, say, really went for very cheap troops. You might have something like 16 if you really, really tried to have just lots of models, but mostly people would have 8, 10, 12 figures aside. Again, in the same way as you said, Infinity or Necromunda or whatever, you're taking... You've got an army list basically to pick from. You choose the types of troops you want. You balance your fighty guys with your shooty guys with your supporting troops and so on. And because it's that scale, because it's that level of game, you can pay more attention to individual models. So it's all based on the individual models and what the individual models are doing, rather than having units that run around together. So yes, so I mean it's not a new style of game at all.
No. Two differences. The first off is obviously it takes place in a very tight space. Well, at least the standard game takes place in a very tight space. It's 2 foot square, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And secondly, and probably definitely more importantly, again, to a certain extent, made almost like a skirmish game, miniatures game, board game hybrid in the way you've designed the game and the way the board works, haven't you?
Yes, I mean it always seems to confuse people, because they when you say it's a bit of a hybrid, because people they decide they don't like whichever bit they didn't like. So I don't like board games, so if it's a hybrid, I won't like it. And you go, well, no, it's not really kind of. That's not quite. It's not the best of both worlds. It's the way of. It's not the worst of both worlds. It's just another way of dealing with it. It's taking bits of different aspects of different games and saying, how can we approach problems that we have in one format by stealing ideas from something else?
Yeah.
So, when I was doing Pandora, I stole the idea of exploding barrels from first-person shooters, because that's cool in first-person shooters. So I thought, well, why not put it in a board game?
Quirky, I remember doing that back in the days of Doom. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And I thought, well, it's fun. It turns up a lot because it's entertaining. So why can't we use this in another format of games? So, you could say that there are aspects of computer gaming in that, which is a board game. In Deadzone, what I've done is I started off with, we wanted to do a skirmish game. And one of the classic fiddly problems with skirmish games is line of sight. That is, in fact, probably the biggest headache. If you're playing things like Necromunda, getting the, in and out of the scenery, when you've got lots of terrain to build up, which is, of course, the idea of Deadzone is that it's fought within the urban environments, because although you're going in on a scale of the Deadzone is several planets large, it's quite a big space. But the resources, the valuable things that people are after, are all in the urban areas, or tend to be in urban areas. And even if it's out in the wilds, someone will have built a refinery next to it, or a mine or something. So there's always kind of a small area of urban clutter to fight over and through. And because the board is, as you said, so small, because the fighting area is so condensed, this gives you this sort of claustrophobic feeling with lots of terrain on the table. So it creates a classic problem of line of sight. What I thought was, I was tinkering with ways of dealing with this, and I came up with a couple of things. What you have, the board, as we said, it's only 2 foot by 2 foot, and it's a grid. It's an 8 square by 8 square grid, 3-inch squares. And normally skirmish games don't have boards that have got markings on. They've just got a piece of terrain. And you have areas of woods or trees or buildings or whatever. And what I've done is a couple of things. One of them is you've got the squares, the grid, gives you an unequivocal way of measuring movement and range. You're never just in or just out. You are 3 squares or 4 squares away. You're one or the other. Yeah. There's no doubt. There's no argument. And it's extremely, it's absolutely as fast as it can be to resolve whether you're in range or not, for example. Mm-hmm. Can I throw a grenade at this guy? Is he 3 away or less? No, he's 5 away. Well, you can't do it. Mm. It's obvious. You don't even have to measure it. You can just tell at a glance. It's dead simple. People like that because that's very fast. The other thing that we've done is line of sight that isn't to do with the grid at all. We'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about the grid. Really, that and movement, because again, movement is and cover actually. Movement is something again. That's something where you get the tape measure out, you measure it. You're either you just short of getting into the building, or you've just you've not quite made it to the barricade to hide behind, and so on. Again, if you say your movement is from this square to that square, then again it's very straightforward. And within an individual square, you can place the model wherever you like, and it's counted as being within that space.
Yeah.
I'm saying squares, but actually in the game they're called cubes because they're 3-dimensional, and the whole idea of having all of this scenery that builds up and the scenery that they've made for Deadzone clips together in sort of all sorts of it's a bit like Lego. You can make it where you like that, and so it goes up as well as across. So the idea being you can build towers and gantries and walkways and all the kind of classic stuff you used to get in Necromunda, and people make out of all these sort of MDF stuff you get for Infinity and what have you. But it's all plastic, so it's all much nicer to work with. Yeah, and so you've got also the idea of cover. And cover is the equivalent of area terrain, but instead of having to have a separate little piece that says this is the area in which this wood is or what have you, and you put the trees on that footprint, you just say this square, this cube is cover or it isn't, and use some crates or whatever just to show that is a cover square, cover cube. And again, it allows you a very, very quick and argument-free presentation of what the terrain is and how far you move and how far you are, which is a way of taking a skirmish game and saying, actually, we don't need a tape measure. You just don't need it because everything is easy to see in front of you. You can simply count the squares. It isn't an argument anymore. There's no way you can have an argument about whether things are in or out of range, or you can or can't get into the building as you run across the alley. You can or you can't. You're in this cube or you're not. It's all very straightforward. Which again, it's good and it's relatively free. It's fast and it's argument free. That's two good things I like.
Yeah, and of course, especially with the fact, you've already talked about range, and whether that's relevant to short-range weapons such as, say, throwing grenades or using pistols. One of the things I loved when you first produced the beta rules for playtesting was the fact that, okay, when it boils down to standard hand weapons, essentially the rules become, if you can see it, you can shoot it because the range is right across the board because it's such a small board.
That's pretty much the case still. I mean, it does vary from weapon to weapon. And I've given everything a range now because some things need range, like pistols and grenades need ranges. So you might as well, if you've got the space to give something range, give everything a range. Then if you play a game on 4 months instead of 2, then you can start getting into the subtleties. I've got an automatic rifle and you've got a sport weapon and so on. So, but basically, fundamentally, given that the thing's an 8x8 grid, and if you're both standing on the board, the maximum range is 7. Unless you've got a very, very tall tower somewhere. So the range could be as high as the tower you care to build, but most people won't build something more than 8 high. So, by and large, you've got a range of 7 is as far as you're going to have on a single board, and believe me, that feels very claustrophobic very, very quickly. People who it starts you at the point of the battle where everything, as the SS say, everything goes noisy, and if things are going to go bad, if people have a sort of nasty assault troops, then they're going to potentially be able to get you if you don't do something about them very quickly. So it gives you that sort of tension. There's not table's width for them to romp across 4 turns to get to you. There's lots of buildings for them to duck in and out of. There's lots of cover. They don't have to go quite as far. So yes, it gives a bit of balance to having armies. Some armies that are very fighty rather than very shooty.
Yeah.
Claustrophobic is kind of exciting for some battles.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is especially in line with some skirmish gaming, or actually a lot of traditional gaming. This is quite a different mechanic. I mean, well, I suppose it's one thing you're becoming known for as approaching approaching mechanic from a slightly different direction.
Yeah, being a bit odd, you mean?
No. I think the word I'm looking for is. I can't even say it now. Innovative. Yeah, I still can't say it properly. Whatever.
Sticks in the throat, eh? Thank you, Neil. I think there's an awful lot of games in the world. There's many, 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 many games, and there's many good games. And if I want people to play what I'm doing, then obviously I need to do something that's equally good, interesting, and different, has its own little place in the world. At the same time, when I'm writing stuff, I could just do something where you add a modifier from a list, and you go, well, kind of been done. I've done that before. Everybody else has done that before. It's kind of not very interesting. I was playing when I was 8. And, I always think that the games that really stick in my head as being clever and really kind of exciting in terms of, doing something different are the ones where they really did look at something and go, hang on, why are we doing this way? We doing it this way because we did it that way last time? And we don't know what we're looking at this. I think every now and again it's worth just looking at what we do, and you say, is the only way to do this? Sometimes the answer is yes, this is the best way to do this. And sometimes the answer is there's another way we could try and see what happens there. And yeah, so I think it's worth trying to be innovative, and I'm sure that lots of them have been done somewhere else in some other format. It's just my combination of them that's a little bit different. But I think it's fresh. It's something to try and be different. And sometimes it works, and sometimes people tell me it's rubbish, and then, go away and try again. You go, that didn't work, right? Okay, let's be different. But like the teleporting teams in Dreadball, I think it's like, I know we could do this kind of outcomes crazy years ago. Well, we do a whole team ports, and everybody looks at me funny and go, no.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Teratons are the coolest models in the game.
Yeah, but as I said, it was one of those things where I had this idea, and I said, well, they can teleport. They'd be like this, and it'd be like teleporting ankylosaurs, and you go, and everybody just looks at you funny, and you go, no, really, no, this is a good idea. Trust me. But sometimes they are ideas, and sometimes they're not. It's going to be. Well, I'm doing some stuff for myself at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see how whether I've gone overboard on the crazy in those ones, because the Eternal Battle is full of weird and wonderful things that I've not seen anywhere else. But I haven't got someone else between me and the public to put the brakes on it. So it's even more prone to being weird and wonderful, I think.
All right, so it really is Thornton Unbound, then, is it?
Yeah, well, I did come up with I took some of the sort of thinking that went into giving Deadzone its unusual board and so on, and ordered to figure gaming, and I tried to work out a way where you could get rid of the board, but not need the treasure. So you went back to having a tabletop for a skirmish game that looked like a normal, traditional figure gaming skirmish tabletop with trees and edges and whatnot, but you didn't need a tape measure. I'm not sure that's going to work like in the real world, but it kind of works in my head, and it works on the people that I'm not sure anyway. It's just me tinkering. I'm not sure whether that really will happen in the real world, but it's something that's worth exploring. We've been playing games where you have a table with hills and trees and we get tape measuring the models this far. And, okay, doing it, but we tried it recently. Let's have a look. Let's see. Kick the tires. See if it really is the best way forward. And, I'm sure some people will think it's absolutely insane and Why on earth would you do that? It's absolute heresy. As long as they don't burn you at the stake, I'm fine with that. Some people think it's fun. But that may be a step too far. We'll have to see. As I said, Thornton and Bam, the world may not be ready yet.
Okay, so going back to Deadzone. So how long? Going back to Deadzone, yes, indeed. So how long have you actually been working on Deadzone? I'm assuming the concept was in your mind long before you actually had a setting to put it in.
Yes and no. I've done lots of stuff on skirmish gaming because, just to digress here, go back to Eternal Battle, which is the skirmish game I'm working on for myself. That has had numerous iterations and has been worked on for well over a decade in all sorts of different incarnations. What's there now is probably completely different from what was there a decade ago, but that hasn't sort of been taken and dropped into Warpath Universe in a way that the stuff I had on the ice hockey and so on was taken and made into Dreadball. This was written specifically for this background. It wasn't actually it was sort of conceptually, and I'd done lots of work in a similar kind of thing, but specific set of rules was built specifically for Deadzone.
Oh, okay. So
it was there's no sort of dust offs to be to be repurposed for this one. This was actually bespoke, made special for Deadzone.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about putting a grid in place to take away all the hassle of tape measures and all the arguments around whether things are in range and how far you move, and whether it's a case of people have moved an inch too far or this, that, and the other. Everything's very clearly delineated. Okay, so now we're talking to the other part, which most people really get involved with as far as skirmish games are concerned, and that are the actual kind of combat mechanics and the dice mechanics and what have you. And here we start to see something which we've already seen in Dreadball.
Yeah, what I've done is I've the same concept in terms of dice rolling, where you have a series of dice you roll and you roll those stats, because that seems to me to be the quickest way, or certainly a very quick way of resolving any kind of test, whether it's combat or whether you've jumped across the gap or whatever it might be that you need to do in a skirmish game. You need to resolve some kinds of things that are certain. The way that we got to with Dreadball, people like it, people find it very intuitive, very, very quickly when you explain it to them. And that being the case, and I kind of haven't been able to think of a better system, so I kept that conceptually. It's different in that all the tests are actually different, all the modifiers are different, what you're doing is different. Obviously, on the Dreadball page, it uses 8-sided dice instead of 6-sided dice, because that was the appropriate sided dice to use. And I know some people get very exercised about the D6, the only pure way forward. That other people decided that D10s are more realistic and this sort of shenanigan. But as far as I'm concerned, it's just a tool. It's part of the toolbox. And whilst D6s work fine for Dreadball, appropriate for that, with the variation in terms of troop type, in model type and equipment that I knew we were going to get into with Deadzone, I thought, well, we're going to need more variation. More steps in this process to have. So if you think about it, on a 6-sided dice, you can't really have a 6 plus a stat. So you've got 2, 3, 4, 5. They're only variable stats. By going to an 8, you've added 2, so you've added 2 more slots or possible positions for the skill to be. And I think 50% was fine. That's what we needed. I looked at going to D10, but actually I didn't think the necessity to do it with Deadzone, because I knew what sort of size list of troops we were going to get to. Didn't think that was necessary. So there's no point going D10s if you don't need to. So we went D8s, and it works well. But mechanically, they were typical of saying, I'm going to do this thing. I get to roll dice. Each one needs whatever my skill is or better. So if I've got a skill of 4+, every dice that rolls a 4 or 5 or 6, 7 or 8 counts as a success, and then I roll my eyes and I get a number of successes, and I compare the number of successes I've got, either you, if we're rolling in a roll, or against a fixed value. And in Deadzone, pretty much everything is an roll, because I think opposed rolls are quite fun. I think they get everybody involved, and I think if I do something to one of your models, and you just have to sort of suffer whatever I've done, then you don't feel like you've had any chance to resist this, because you haven't.
Yeah.
But if you get to roll some dice, even if you have almost no chance of succeeding, you at least feel involved. And I think that's quite important. I like to feel that they were at least some sort of, they had a chance to do something to save their man. And I think, I like that. I think people feeling like, that kind of involved and a part of the whole process of whatever it is that's taking their men off. So, yeah, most of them are, I think, almost everything is an opposed roll. You roll some dice, I roll some dice, which you get most successes. And then compare those successes to each other, the number of successes to each other. The core mechanics is the same core mechanic.
As far as, again, core mechanics were concerned, and I suppose this is something that came out during kind of open, I suppose, beta testing, was one of the very first things you were addressed was originally the game was designed around an I go, you go mechanic as far as turn sequence is concerned. And that became something a lot more dynamic once you got some feedback, didn't it?
Well, it was one of those things where I was kind of playing devil's advocate, because the I go, you go wasn't really something I was particularly keen on. So they just in general isn't a mechanic I very much like. But at that size game, the original game that was that big, very, very small scenario. And technically, what we have ended up with as the alternate calculation is a similar result to the original version. If you play that scenario, nothing. But obviously, we're not. So partly what I was doing was seeing what people thought when I did that. And partly it was because when I had to put that out and give that to Mantic to put the bit that I knew that I wanted to use as a driver for how you decide who got to move how many models in their turn, was the command system that I hadn't finished, and that was being awkward. So I was a bit later than I wanted it to be. So I was left with a position where I had to put something out, and I thought I could put out a half-hearted, which doesn't really work. Or I put out a fixed version, but I don't really like the idea. The whole idea of command system as it has. So it took a lot of interaction with how when you build a force, you can choose a different kind of commander who will be better or worse at fighting, better or worse at commanding troops. And ones that are better at commanding troops give you more flexibility within a turn. So you actually have this possibility. I'm going to have a fighty commander, or I'm going to have a leader as a commander who's good at leading people, doing stuff. But it's a choice. What your style of play, what your different factions that are good at different things and different options. But that whole aspect of it wasn't there yet. Rather than do a kind of half-hearted version, I wanted to sort of bang stuffing on people as a piece. This is what I really meant. So we did within the first bit, and as I kind of hoped, everybody said they didn't like it, which is what I wanted as well, which is great.
All right, so it was the old reverse psychology, was it?
Kind of, yeah. It was sort of a way of testing the waters and finding out what people wanted, because you get things like, there's some alternate activation games, some game, oh, they got that Warhammer 40k, priority pressure stuff. That's all. These things are all I I think it's not the best way of doing it, but people, by their thousands, go out and buy the games and play them. So obviously, there are plenty of people who are happy with this. So I thought, well, we'll see what people say.
I know during the whole conversation that you had, which I mean, for one thing, I don't want to compliment you on that fact of going through that beta testing phase. I thought it was a great thing to do, because while that was happening during the Kickstarter process, it got an awful lot of people invested in the game and actually felt like they were, contributing to what was going on in addition to the whole Kickstarter thing that was going on in the background. And I thought that was really good, and a really great thing to do. Right, so as part of that, I know you were very conscious of not falling into what you called the cheerleader mentality.
Yeah, it's a classic problem or has become a classic problem, where you have a number of activations generated by the number of models you have, and you can use them on any happens in Infinity. And they've mitigated this in more recent things, but basically the question is you get a whole, I get 10 men, and one of them runs around and does everything, and he's obviously my best. And I generate 10 actions because I've got 10 models, but none of them stand at the back and cheer for him as he runs around and uses 10 actions a turn. Mm. That's the problem, and that's always been a core problem of the way Infinity's set up, and I think it's not very interesting, and it's clearly not what they really want you to be doing. But it's such an obvious way of exploiting how the rules set up. So I didn't want to do that because it's just not the best way of doing it. And I've kind of been backpedaling away from that by iterating with different things. But I think it's a very much kind of built-in core problem with that approach. So I wanted having ways of generating a number of actions and sort of allowing you to do it. I kind of had it in my head that I wanted to put some sort of command control, just a different character for commanders within the game itself. And I kind of had that would all link up, but I hadn't initially worked out exactly how that would kind of function. And the way it does work in the end is to have a commander that his standard is the number of things you can activate in turn at maximum. So if you have a commander who's got 5 things, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can do at least 1 when it's your turn.
Yeah.
But the difference between that and having someone who's got 3, obviously, if you can kind of rush with 5 people and kind of set up to watch you move into position, someone can cover you, then the other guy runs in and executes the attack. That allows you much more flexibility and to do much more maneuvers than if you've just got someone who moves 3 things or 2. Also, by basing it on the highest command of the person on the battlefield, if you lose commanders, the ability to control the game as a whole, in terms of how many men you can move and so on, it degrades. So there's a real-time reaction in your command ability getting worse because you've lost your commander.
Yeah.
So I thought it was great. I really like that. And the whole thing encourages you to work with little teams and just getting one guy who's really good and then everybody else generate actions and this guy romps around and does everything. It's saying, right, I need somebody to do some suppression over here and then somebody else can run around and position himself for an overwatch in case anybody tries to flank me, and then I'll get this other guy. And just when I was popped down the corridor, then we go, right, now I'm running my assault down. And everybody's acting to support, doing their bit to support you guys.
Yeah.
I think that's much more an interesting way of playing.
Oh, certainly, yeah, because it does introduce the whole thing of team tactics and making sure you get things set up in such a way that your forces actually support each other, fire and maneuver, what have you, which is some games encourage, some games don't.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's an interesting aspect that you don't see as much. You see more that don't bother with it than do, or that if they bother with it, they bother with it in a very specialised little niche corner. General, and I wanted to basically include this in as broad a way as possible. So there's many teams I think I can think of where you absolutely, you're required to do something with 2 people to make something happen. But it's just a good idea. You often get a benefit of it because it's people are often good at one thing or another, and working out how jigsaw together into a solid attack is really part of the skill of being good at this.
Yeah.
So I think that's fun, and yeah. And all of that, I mean, you were talking before about how we had the Deadzone, and I think that a very important aspect of getting this to be quite where it is now is partly because you get the idea of what people want in terms of what kind of game they want, but also you get to be able to talk to people about things like, wanting the synergy of troops and wanting the tactics to interlock between different models, and you get to see whether people like that idea or not. You can kind of float things past and go, what's everybody think of this? This is what we're thinking of. This is the idea. And you get some people go, you get some things everybody likes and some things everybody doesn't like, and then you can kind of react and put different spins on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the game itself is very, very scenario and mission driven. And again, that seems to be apparent that was very much the thing right from the start. It wasn't just a case of just turn up and do battle, like it seems to be the case in an awful lot of games. That there is, I mean, whilst and I suppose there is that encounter aspect that you can use in the game. It seems to be very much more a case of this is very mission driven. Yeah,
or you've got to balance two things. I mean, some people don't like scenarios. I quite like scenarios because I like the story of it. And there is the Sci campaign, which is not in the core book, but kind of down the road. But I like that kind of environment where you've got a lot of detailed story about why things are the way they are and limitations on your setup because such and such is the ground and this happened. I think that's quite fun. Not everybody likes that though, and reality is that most people will turn up to their mate's house or the game club or whatever, and they'll have brought their army. Maybe they've worked out their army in advance, what usually happens, and then they want to basically just throw down and have a game.
Yeah.
Look at scenarios or whatever, and people perceive scenarios as more complicated than they are. Most of the time, scenarios are exactly what you have to do. So, anyway, that's a different argument. What I wanted to do was you've got this reality where people will turn up and basically, I've got my army worked out, you've got your army worked out, we turned up at the club, we agreed to play a game, right, now let's just, throw down some scenery and off we go. Now, that's great, and people do that a lot with lots of games, but I thought, well, maybe there's some ways of pulling into this a whole bunch more interesting elements so that games are playing each time, and also that you're prodded into thinking in more interesting ways. So this is where the idea comes from. You've got cards to say who moves first, you've got cards to say what your setup is, you set up the board, and you draw a card to see what your actual deployment is, what your deployment is, which may be different each time. And you also have missions, and the missions are secret. Now, each faction has a number of missions that are specific to that faction. Now, occasionally they overlap with each other, but basically the selection you've got is different for each race. And this gives you the ability to characterize that race. So rebels sometimes go in and they want to just mix stuff because they haven't got enough supplies. So they're interested in kind of finding things and pulling all of that.
Mm-hmm.
The Plague, on the other hand, basically just want to go and tear some heads off. And that's pretty much what they're like. They're not bothered about picking things up. That's just interesting to them. So they won't be doing that mission. But they've got their own thing. So each person picks, and by having a standard setup, you can set up the table very quickly.
Yeah. The
standard setup includes like grades or spare ammo. It includes objective markers that may or may not be used depending on who gets what mission. But you set them up anyway. Used. So you've got a standard setup, which means it's very quick to set up. Then you've got a turn of a card tells you where your deployment zones are, because they're marked in the grid. It's very, very easy to see what that is. So that's very, and you've a mission that's secret that then tells you what you're doing, tells you what you need to do to get victory points. And all of the things that are involved in that mission, either models in the other room to kill, or models on your side to escape with, or things on the board to interact with, whether there are objectives or whatever. So everything's already there, but it enables you to tell a much more interesting story very, very quickly. So I'm not getting away much if people just wanting to turn up at the club and play. They have to turn over 2 or 3 cards.
Mm.
So it's not but at the same time, it's a much more interesting thing than just setting up and bashing our heads and playing the same battle each week. The interaction between what your secret mission and what my secret mission is well completely different than what you're doing. I can guess what you're doing, but I don't know whether you're bluffing. So, are you trying to hold that objective because really part of your mission, or are you just trying to make me think that that's important, so I'm wasting trying to push through it?
Yes.
And there's all of that kind of fun and bluff and double bluff going on. And, of course, depending on what missions we've each drawn from our set of, I think it's 80, the number of combinations is whatever it is. It's lots. There's also, because the table can be set up differently. You set up you just set up some buildings and some series, walkways and some cover and whatnot, but we could set that up differently, and then because we deploy in a different area where the card says we should have our deployment zones, that will dictate the kind of variations. Even with the same mission combinations, you'll still get a different game because we'll be fighting in a different game.
Yes.
So it's just a way of putting, not getting in the way of people playing a game quickly, getting to and getting on with it, but actually some way of just saying, well, hang on, let's just do a little more different. Just put a little twist in this, so you can kind of play something a little bit more characterful, a little bit more interesting.
Now, obviously, we've been talking about a standard board, which is 2 foot by 2 foot. Almost immediately, as the Kickstarter project went on, people started asking questions. Hang on a second. Okay, this is quite a small board. Can we play this in a bigger environment? Was that something you'd always envisaged, to actually up it to either a 4x2 or to a 4x4 board? Was that somewhere you'd already thought, yes, we can go there, or was this something you suddenly had to react to?
Well, Ronnie wants to fight enormous battles all the time. He can't help himself. He just likes the huge sort of sweep of massed armies, and this is what the whole clique has always very fairly nailed its colours to the wall here. About this is what Mantic. Ronnie wasn't going to let me get away with having my neat little sort of bijou and cramped little battles and corn. I quite like that confine of the 2 foot by 2 foot, because I think it gives you a different discipline to deal with.
Yeah. Also,
as a player.
Yes, and also because of that confinement, and especially when it comes down to setup, it starts concentrating people's minds into the fact of this is a 3D game. So there aren't that many games on tabletop games, especially I think since Necromunda really, that have really try to encourage people to think, well, let's not just not go out, let's go up. And that was something, especially with the claustrophobic confines of Deadzone, that was something that was kind of really encouraged, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, this is it. I mean, if you've got a battlefield, but at the same time you can go up, then very much you're encouraged to go up. And fighting in and out of the 2nd, 3rd, 5th floors. And if you spread out over flat, then there's much less encouragement to build up. And you start getting this sort of much more separate, I've got a building, you've got a building over there. Whereas in a normal 2 foot Deadzone board, you've got almost a continuous spread of buildings with 1 square wide alleyways between them and so on, but walkways over them and things linked up at different levels and what have you.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on what you want to build, but this is kind of how I like to think things. So yeah, we were always thinking. Well, Ronnie kind of was very much always keen on the idea of bigger battles, just because that's what he likes most. So we always had this kind of yes, we'll talk about that. And I think what's most interesting to me about the larger battles is they change the flow of the whole game. So if you play a game as a 2-map, whether you play these as a 2-map side by side or a 2-map between us deep, get a massive difference to how the game works. And I think, again, of course, and then if you play a 4-by kind of those together, I think it's intriguing. It's the way in which you have to think as a player that changes most as games, because mechanically it's the same game. There's no real difference. All that happens is that if we play a game that's, say, two mats between us, so it's 4 foot between us, 2 foot between us, we have a whole new approach phase that doesn't exist in a normal game because you're already in each other's face right from the beginning.
Yeah.
You've got 4 foot depth, and it's all you very often can't see very well for most of the board length. So it's very likely a sort of sneaking ball phase, filtering into positions, getting her snipers up in towers, and that's quite interesting. And also, it gives you the opportunity to start trying to grab bits of real estate and define your own, your own front line. And this is more like a deliberate attack than the way I tend to look at the Deadzone game as the sort of thing when you read accounts from the sort of SAS units and things and people who are involved in that, where they generally 4 things. If it's not a deliberate assault on a particular building or something like that, the firefights they get into are often by accident and at very close range. And at that point, you don't really have the ability to define a nice, filter forward and define yourself a nice kind of front line. You make this what you got.
Yes.
And fight from there. That's kind of the way Deadzone works in a normal game, in a normal 1 game 2x2 square. But if you've got the extra depth, you're interesting sort of changes the way the whole dynamic works because you pick and choose when that fight happens. And if you've got the whole 2x2 maps, so you've got 4 people, then you suddenly start getting the bigger ranged weapons start coming into their own. You start getting while I'm filtering forward, mortaring you or snipering off individuals, and then you get into the next tier of sort of normal small arms fire range and so on. So it becomes much more like a normal battle, as it were, like a bigger tabletop battle, where you have a phase where you can affect people subordinately, and then you get a phase where normal arm effect, and you get to close assault range at the end. And it's really interesting to see how it very clearly models those sort of different types of that. But mechanically, it's the same game.
Yeah.
There's a couple of tweaks to deal with having more physical space, and again, you get the other things about if you play a big game with the same number of models, you get all sorts of interesting things about how you choose to move around in what size groups, because if you don't change the mechanics, but change the in which you're playing, then you have to kind of work out whether you're going to split your men up or all around in the huddle, or whether you're going to try and sort of cover the whole frontage, and it gives you another set of interesting troubles work your way around. Which again, what's fun about gaming is solving these tactical puzzles. We thought about that in the beginning, but not in a terribly specific way. In terms of Ronnie was going, let's do some multi-map games, and I went, okay, and then we did the Kickstarter. So kind of knew it was going to happen, but quite actually work.
You've already mentioned that when you designed Deadzone, it was very much a case of you already had the idea of designing it inside of this particular universe. I know one thing that became very apparent to me was as soon as I started playing the beta rules, was kind of going, hey, I really like this. I wonder how it would work in a standard sci-fi environment. So take it into like a standard hard sci-fi environment, if you like, where you have 2 rather than asymmetric forces. You have 2 similar sized forces fighting each other, and take it into a different contexts. So actually use it as a almost like a default set of sci-fi skirmish rules, because really liked the way the mechanics worked. I mean, was that something you kind of envisaged, you yourself had potentially envisaged? I mean, I know we've kind of seen a variation on some of the mechanics with Mars Attacks, but is this something that you kind of envisaged right from the start?
I think it partly comes from my work on Eternal Battle, as I said, which is a generic rule set you learn once and then apply in different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I think because I'm thinking about that, it naturally filters through to an extent. And basically planned portable to different backgrounds. I mean, you could, and I started fighting the same faction. So we could both fight. You're talking about symmetrical battles or asymmetric warfare. We could both have a corporation war, and fight with the rules as they stand.
Yeah, sure.
And so you get that kind of, you would get that kind of some of that. And it works fine for that. I've done several games that were match forces. And of course that becomes much more sort of chess-like, not the same set on each side. It becomes much more what you do with it. But it wasn't needed to be because when Deadzone was started, I don't think was even discussed. I don't think.
Mm.
But I'm fairly sure Mars Attacks came along afterwards. They try and keep you in the dark so that I focus on what's in front of me and going, oh, shiny! Shiny, can I play with that? Which, of course, gamers always do when there's new shiny toys about. So, and the way in which Mars Attacks uses this, I think there's really the same relationship there is with Dreadball in many ways. It's more similar to Deadzone in that it's obviously a game about moving and shooting and so on. It's a skirmish game rather than a sports game, but it's still got, other than a lot of differences, the way in which Mars Attacks works from Deadzone, because it's kind of worldview. It's a comic worldview, as it were. It's not a comic, but it's kind of comic Marvel universe kind of view of the world. It's not quite real, whereas Deadzone's a bit more trying to be a little bit more real in some regard in terms of the way in which it takes and interacting and teamwork and so on.
Yeah.
So it wasn't designed as a set, although I think Ronnie said before that we might come back to this as other Deadzones because this is an infested Deadzone and that gives it a certain character. But there are other kinds of Deadzones. Deadzone Protocol is not just loaded for the plague. That's the particularly unhappy version of it. But there are other alien incursions. There's vermin incursions. There's all manner of naughtiness. We may go back and visit it again in that guise.
Obviously, one thing that came up an awful lot on the KS was to do with the particular races involved. Because obviously, as you say, we start off in the basic box with the fact that we've got the corporation with the enforcers and the plague. Then you've added the rebels and the not orcs. What do you call them? Marauders. Yes. So then you've got the Marauders. Obviously, in the expansion, we've got the Forge Fathers and the Asterians, especially in the light of things like Project Pandora. Everybody was asking, where the vermin?
Yeah. Well, under your feet, 3 meters away, never further. Vermin are everywhere. So there would be vermin. It's just there's not, we've not come across large concentrations of them. It's keeping out the way of the plague. And like bats leaving a sinking planet. The plague turn up, the vermin all depart. I think one of the things about it is that you just carry on adding races sort of indefinitely. But I think it's a bit more entertaining if you can give things a particular story. So in Deadzone, what we have is there's plague. There's now plague. The force is going to solve it, and the other factions are sort of all their own vested interests getting in the way and pinching around the edges. I think that the vermin are kind of in their own way would make a very good major antagonist. So if we kind of use them too early, we kind of lose the possibility of telling a really exciting story around them. See what I mean?
Yes.
I think they kind of they would make a good host for just so I mean as they did in Pandora in their own way, which we make some other. Someone says, "Was this supposed to replace Pandora?" And I think that's kind of missing the idea that you can take a background and then look at the background in different ways, and do different things with it, pose different kind of challenges to a player. Pandora, same thing Deadzone does at all. It's a different kind of game, and there's room for both those kinds of games.
So in the initial release, which is coming out start of December, as I say, we're looking at the Enforcers, the Plague, the Rebels, and the Marauders.
Yeah.
And then we have Wave 2, which is due Q2 next year, I think it is, isn't it? Or back into quarter one, maybe?
End quarter one, in quarter two, yeah, I think something like that.
Okay,
yeah.
which is Forge Fathers and Asterians?
If you watch my blog, you may see some card sets out rather soon, as in within the next few weeks.
Oh, right, okay. Now,
just going out again for people to be kicking around, people have got the rules, so I just got sent a digital copy of the rules. So I'll be doing the FAQ based on, people's queries about that. And when people, as people already have them, if I have a set of cards for the Asterians and the Forge Fathers, that it will be very helpful if people wanted to look and see what they could break before we print them. You don't print several of them and decide that they don't work. You want to decide that they don't work and fix it and then print them. Keep an eye on quirkworthy.com. I'm sure there'll be some interesting things to download and play with.
Right, okay. Now,
so yes,
and then obviously we've got bigger battlefields. We've got the start of the use of some vehicles.
Those naughty goblins.
Yes, the naughty goblins, and yes, the use of some big exosuits, walkers, or what have you, or mechs. That's the word I was after, mechs. And obviously that's kind of within the scope of where the Kickstarter kind of got to. Once we've got to that point, are we then looking at moving Deadzone further? Is there more to come?
I think there's other things to do with it, but that's not necessarily just making it bigger. I think you've got to remember that there's Warpath as well. Warpath is a different game that is designed, as I was saying about Ronnie liking big battles. Well, this is where Ronnie gets to really do the big battles, which makes sense if they were larger than Deadzone is. Deadzone, at the end of the day, is not really intended to be a sort of 12x5 game.
Yes,
because you're dealing with individual figures, and it's going to become unwieldy at that. So it's not practical to work with 200 models on the side or 300 models on the side when you're moving individual models. It's just too many individual pieces to deal with.
Yes.
So when you get really big games, you want things to be in squads. So and that's kind of where Warpath comes in. So there's a point at which Deadzone gets big enough to sort of hand over to Warpath in terms of where you go and sort of getting larger. And that, as I said, is mainly a sort of practicality issue of simply moving individual models. And you could rewrite the way the models, but then you're writing Warpath instead. So, why not? So I think that there are other things we can do with it. Things like we've got the Nexus campaign, which is a narrative campaign with a series of specific scenarios to refight a particular series of battles.
Yes.
There are units and vehicles and whatnot that we can add that will give people more, allow people more things into the mix, so that you play in a action and you play for a while and you learn what the different things do. And they give you 4 or 5 of them, that sort of twists the way in which you can interact. Some of them bounce off the way they interact well with things you already have, maybe didn't use so much. And so that kind of, allows you to get more, again, of the individual factions. So there's ways of doing things like that. And also coming up with some new missions. I'm dealing with some things that are particularly 2-player versus 2-player, things like that. So there's a number of different ways we can kind of tweak it. And in some ways it depends on what people like playing. I mean, it could be that we do big battle versions and everybody goes, I really like 2-map games. Nobody likes playing 4 games. Everybody likes playing 2-map games. And that becomes the standard phase. And you go, okay, well, let's do some more of that then, because that's what everybody likes playing. Yes. We'll just see what happens, really. See what more people enjoy. And there's obviously more factions and more versions to sort of look at, but whether they will be little extra bits, whether they will be whole other Kickstarters, or I don't know. I have to see. It sort of depends on how big things are, really. But I think some of this, if you primed a certain amount, the Kickstarter got a huge amount of different bits and we've already got the core game, 2 extra factions, a narrative campaign, large games or multi-mats also. That's a fair deal to be starting with. And once people have got it and they're playing it and we get feedback of what people like, then we can look at, making something that people want.
Yeah, so obviously, you're talking about the potential of, where you didn't want Deadzone to become a much bigger game because it, as I say, it effectively turns into Warpath. However, we've seen in the past, whether it be the likes of 40k, going into, the city fight sort of thing, or it's not just sci-fi, things with World War II, what have you, and fighting in urban environments, and especially when you start thinking about things like Stalingrad and fighting in Berlin and that sort of thing, really big urban city fights. Really, as far as Deadzone is concerned, you're in that environment already, and essentially you're just expanding that urban environment, are you? As opposed to having an environment which is originally quite open, and then suddenly having to make up all these extra rules for fighting in urban environments. You're actually starting in a tight, claustrophobic environment, which from this side of things is a bit more an advantage, and some would argue makes for a better game. I mean, there's always this argument that skirmish games are much, much better when there's lots of cover on the table. And let's face it, you can't get much more cover than being in a fully urban environment, can you?
Not really, no. I think it's you're right. Look, people, especially the bigger games, start with. I think what happens is the bigger games start with the idea that you have a blank table and you put things on it. You need every time you put something on the table, you need a rule for that thing, whether it's a forest or a building or whatever. And I think that rapidly builds up to a very large list of extra rules. Whereas if your environment, if the datum isn't an open field but a cluster of buildings, then you kind of take that as read. So, for example, the assumption is with a shot in Deadzone, the assumption is that it will be a shot at a partly concealed target. And that is the shot that has no modifiers, because the rules are designed to say the normal average shot will be at someone you see partly as they go past a window or look around the corner of a wall or whatever. So you don't have a modifier for that. Whereas if you start with the idea that your normal shot is at somebody in the open, then as soon as you have them sticking out from behind a wall, there's a modifier involved, which may not sound like much, but it's just the beginning of a sort of extra rules for this and extra rules for that. So I think conversely, we've got we've got a modifier for someone being in the open, but it doesn't happen very often. So if you've got a tabletop which is mostly open with a couple of buildings, then having the modifiers for the bits that don't happen very often makes sense. But this is the other way around. It's got a full and cluttered environment, so the modifiers are for the bits that don't happen very often, which is the people standing around in the open, getting shot. What happens when you stand in the open for more than half a second? But I think you're right. It's interesting to come at it from a different kind of end, where you say the assumption is clutter and built up and blocked lines of sight and rubble to clamber over, and then you say, well, we don't need. Therefore, you don't have. I think whatever you start with, if you started with a game that the assumption is that everywhere's a swamp, then you wouldn't have everyone moves at half rate in swamp, because otherwise you'd never do anything. You have your normal rules with no modifiers and no penalty are for whatever is standard, whatever is average in this situation. And it just depends. I mean, being very, very different when it's lots of clutter for building or extra levels or dense forests or swamps or whatever, it just adds extra rules. So when you're right that things can get quite cluttered mechanically in terms of rules when you start with the assumption that you've got a blank kind of field, and then you plonk things on it and keep plonking extra stuff on it, especially with buildings, because people always have lots of things like City Fight have different kinds of buildings and different kinds of walls, and is it stone or wood or built up or fortified or sandbagged or whatever, and this becomes increasingly complicated very quickly. All with best intents of modelling some sort of reality with it, but you've got to question how much more fun you're having for all that extra time spent looking at what the different modifier for someone who's filled the sandbags with mud rather than sand are.
Yes, there comes a point where you kind of think, yes, with the way Deadzone has been designed, and with this expectation that actually, almost like, cover is the norm. So actually, the battlefield is a lot more cluttered than even what it appears, and that actually, bits of cover that are on the battlefield are only representative of what is actually an awful lot more. Is that the sort of thing I'm getting? Yeah.
Well, you've got two kinds of things getting in the way in Deadzone. You've got the walls, the buildings themselves, and then you've got the concept of cover. And cover means the word cover means a very specific thing in Deadzone. It means that you have cover cubes. An individual cube will be defined as being cover or not, and this is an area terrain type. So if you're playing a game of Warhammer or some other fantasy game, you'll have an area terrain like forests, because it's not practical to model every branch and twig and bush, let alone shrubberies, in a forest.
Sorry.
Absolutely. Because it's not practical to model all of those and then get your models in and move around, you abstract it to a degree. You say that those, it's -2 to hit if you're standing within the area of that stuff. So because we've got the gridded board, we can say this cube, this bit, is cover. And cover is the same kind of thing. It's an equivalent thing in an urban environment. It's the piles of rubble. It's the inside of an office building that's been blown out of the second story and landed in the street. So it's bits of filing storage, desks, computers, gubbins in the way. But at the same time, you've got to move your models in and out without them falling over all the time. So there's got to be practical sort of balance here between what you can actually model and what you want to be putting there. So in a messy urban environment, you look at any news item about what's going on in Syria, the place is a mess. I mean, boy, do they need cleaning up. There's not just a neat wall and then another neat wall and then really, raggedy at the top, but there's neat bits everywhere. There's rubble. When people model blown up buildings, ruined buildings, they very often forget that when you knock a wall down, it goes somewhere. The bits that fall off land somewhere. But the problem is, when you do model that, your toy soldiers fall over all the time because they're standing on piles of rubble that are at funny angles and bits sticking out everywhere, and it looks great, but you can't actually put the models on it. We used to do this when I used to work for Workshop years ago. When I was on White Dwarf, we'd do things like battle reports, and we'd be fighting over the studio terrain that was really designed to take photographs on. So it was beautiful stuff, marvellously modelled, beautiful pieces, but it wasn't very good for gaming on because you couldn't stand the models on half of it. Because it was so busy looking nice and looking right and, piles of rubbles and funny slopes of bricks and bits of girders sticking out at angles that you couldn't actually put the model flat anywhere. It would just fall over. So it wasn't really any good for playing on. And so in Deadzone, we've said, right, well, we've got models of barrels and crates and stuff, generally that has flat tops you can stand on. But also what we're doing is we're saying this is a representation of the rest of the crap that's lying around that's going to be blown off the buildings or been blown out of these rooms. So they give you, if you're in this area, we assume the soldier will take cover behind this stuff. But we've not modelled all of it because it's not practical to model all of it. So we have this abstract where we say this cube counts as cover.
Yeah.
Because it's, as I said, you've got to balance at the end of the day, you've got to balance the fact that you and I are moving little toy soldiers around a board. And that's not, they don't have the ability to move and adapt to the terrain that real people do, because they can't kind of lean into the wall to peer around the corner. They're molded in a way that they are, and that's it. They're standing in that way.
Yeah.
So you've got to make some sort of compromise here and there, which is a pity because you'd like not to have to make the compromise. And if I can work out how to avoid doing it, then I will. But you either ignore the fact that there would be lots of rubbish around really for people to hide behind, and just pretend it's not there, and then you say every bit of line of sight is exactly what it really is. But I think that's kind of missing I think the concept of cover gives you some of the flavour of the sort of mess that this place is in by saying, by thinking about what is, all these great patches of cover and these rubble and the ruins and the bags and baggage and gubbins that's just everywhere, between all the buildings, and gives you the idea that this is just, gives you sort of a picture in your mind's eye of more like what it would be to see.
Yeah, and of course that introduces something else which we kind of hinted at right at the beginning, which is to do with some issues around line of sight, doesn't it? Because some people start to get quite caught up in how the line of sight actually works.
They did, yes. I mean, one of the things I tend to do is I tend to go for what is the simplest way to model whatever it is we're trying to model. So in terms of the movement, the ranges, and so on, this is where we came to the grid. And so, we'd been the idea of the tape measure. With line of sight, there's a number of awkward different ways of doing line of sight. Basically, can my model shoot your model is what we're trying to do. That's what we want to know. So people often get confused they start doing more and more intricate bits of how you define what you can see or where you can see from, and they get themselves increasingly tangled up. There's quite a lot of rule sets where there's very elaborate rules for lines of sight, and they're often pages long with several diagrams to explain whether you can and can't see things. And whilst they may work, they're not exactly intuitive or fast. They always end up with arguments. They're absolutely one of the most common areas for people to argue and debate about detailed rules. The more detailed rules you put in for line of sight, the more people argue about them. And one of the things that what I've done here is basically just pare this back to as simple as I can make it, which is, can this model, you look from the head of the model that's doing the shooting, or the looking theory, and you say, can this model see the model I'm shooting at? And that's it. That's the rule. And if I can, then I can shoot it. And if I can't, then I can't. Barring several other things, doing area fire and whatever. But if we're not doing area fire, if I'm trying to put a round straight through you, I need to be able to see you. And the easiest way, the most straightforward way, the way I would have done when I was 10, was I would have looked to see if this model can see that model. And it's just, I thought, well, this is, it worked fine. That's my intuitive way of doing it, was you bend down, you look at the model, you say, can this model see that one? And you can or you can't. And you can or you can't because I'm taking the model to be the whole model, including the base. When you pick it up, what comes up with it, the base comes with it, the arms, the legs, the weapon, the hat, the cape, everything comes with it. Assuming you haven't broken it. But that is the target. That's, and obviously we all know that these models are frozen in a moment of time and would really be moving and conforming to the terrain and whatnot. So there's all these arguments about, but he's sticking his arm out, or he's got a big hat and with guns out a funny angle, whatever. So that's not fair that you're able to see the gun and then shoot me. To which I say, well, somebody put that model there with his gun sticking out around the corner. And that was you. So if you put him in a silly position with his gun sticking out around the corner, then you kind of open yourself to the shit. You knew that was what the rule was. If you put yourself in an exposed position, you've chosen to put yourself there for a reason. Could be that you want to see around the corner so you can shoot back. That would be a good thing for people with guns on the whole. And so the rule is very simple. If you can see a part of the model you want to shoot at, then you can shoot it. And people get confused, and there was two main suggestions or two main topics of conversation about this. Apart from the fact that people just get confused, they think the rule is more complicated than it is. The rule is very, very, very simple. Can this model see that model? Yes or no? That's the rule. And people get confused because they think there are other rules that, there are things, there are all sorts of caveats, and there aren't. And the reason I think why people think there are caveats is mainly because we've got Games Workshop in 40k have the rule that they call true line of sight that isn't. That's not true. True line of sight, according to 40k, is can this model, we start with the same principle, can this model see that model? Except the target model, it doesn't count the base, it doesn't count, there's a list of bits it doesn't count. It counts the head, it counts the body, it counts certain bits, and it doesn't count other bits. What that means is you open yourself to this massive argument about, well, if I could see through the cape that doesn't count, I could see his torso, but I can't see his torso because his cape's in the way. Or, does his tentacle count? Does his ear count? Does his aerial on the side of his helmet count? Some things they are clear about, some things they're not so clear about. And that is a massive nest of worms about whether it is or isn't a legal thing to look at when you're looking at it. It's far simpler just to say, can you see any of it? Yes or no? Much simpler. There's always going to be those instances where it's right on the cusp, but any line of sight will have that issue.
Yes.
So I'm ignoring that because it happens with everything. So there's no way around that bit. So, but the simplest thing for me, as far as I can see, is can I see it? Yes, I can, or no, I can't. And when I say it, I mean any part of that model at all, any bit.
I remember, way back in one of the few tournaments I entered. I was playing in a Necromunda tournament, and you have this one of the special rules in Necromunda, whereas you could have an action to basically put yourself up against a wall, so you're kind of effectively going into hiding. And having an argument with, I'm sure it was a spirited discussion. It wasn't an argument at all. About the fact that this guy had said that the chap involved, his ganger had was taking best advantage of cover, this, that, and the other. Except for the fact that I had a model that had clear line of sight on his model. Now, the rule states that you can effectively do it as if you're hiding around a corner from somebody, but I had clear line of sight on him from so the cover he was effectively saying he was hiding behind didn't count against this particular model, and because of ambiguity, we had this issue of not only line of sight, but also where the cover counted. And as you say, because it's the crux of an awful lot of rules regarding, how easy it is to shoot somebody, and cover a line of sight has so much to do with that. As you say, it leads to one of the biggest arguments, especially if you're playing in tournaments or what have you. But even in friendly games, this whole thing of whether you can shoot something or not causes no end of issues between people, doesn't it?
Absolutely, which is why I wanted to avoid as much of it as I possibly could. I mean, you get other games where as you're saying, models are not where they actually are, which is what you're hiding around the corner thing. Is, I spend an action so I crouch down, and you go, well, how do I work out line of sight? Someone's not actually in the position it says it. Well, you can't clearly do that. I mean, the other thing people suggested was the privateer system, where you have a cylindrical volume, an imaginary cylindrical volume of a set height depending on your base size, which actually works reasonably well in War Machine and Hordes, because they're essentially dealing with a two-dimensional game. There's very little 3D in those games. And so what it means is you can look from above and use the size of the base as a sort of to get charge corridors and whatnot. And it works quite well. But when you deal with that in 3 dimensions, what you end up saying is, I've got an invisible cylinder, the size of my base, and I'm looking from my invisible cylinder to your invisible cylinder, round and through cover. And it becomes horribly complicated. And I just thought, well, how? And someone was telling me, it was very passionately saying this was the way forwards, and that this was simpler. Use it looking from an imaginary volume, an imaginary invisible volume, to another imaginary invisible volume across and through terrain was easier than looking from a physical object to another physical object. And I couldn't quite see how that was true. It's a lovely concept, but it just, within this environment, physical tabletop environment, it just doesn't work. Well, technically it does work. It's just very fiddly. And you get situations again and again where the invisible volume would be visible, if you follow me,
yes,
through the window, but the actual model isn't.
Yes.
And that starts making things really bizarre. And so I've just gone for, as I said, I've gone for what I can see as paring it back to the absolute kernel that cannot be reduced any further, which is, can this model see that model? Yes or no? And then if you want your man who's got his arm out pointing not to be visible because he's stuck his arm around the corner, when you move your model, don't stick the arm putting out around the corner. It's pretty simple, really.
Yes.
You can see where the enemy is, and they can see where you are. When you move the model, the person that moves the model, the person that owns the model, always gets to choose where that model is positioned within the cube. So it's there, and all you have 360 view on. All the models have 360 degree arc of line of sight. So there's no reason to say, well, I had to put it that way because I wanted to look in that direction. No. If you want it to not stick around the corner, then don't stick the model around the corner. If you do, then you're taking a risk. But you know you're taking a risk. And any game is about taking risks and knowing that you're taking risk and balancing the benefit against the risk. That's what it's all about. It's just a microcosm of that specific little puzzle.
Yeah.
So, yes.
But then, of course, you've got the other aspect of fire, which is something we haven't talked about at all, which is the kind of area suppression blaze away action, as it's called in the game.
Blazing away, yes.
Yes, which is not point-to-point fire, but firing at a cube. And that kind of puts a completely different, that's a different aspect, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what you're doing there, it's basically splitting the world into, am I trying to, shoot a specific thing? Am I trying to shoot you between the eyes with a single shot, which is what shooting is, which way you need the line of sight to a particular target? Or am I just trying to close down this general area to make you keep your head down, which is what blazing away is? And obviously, if you're trying to shoot something specific, you need to be able to see that specific thing. If I'm just trying to, if I know you're in there somewhere, I know you're behind the wall, I can kind of hear you rummaging around in that bit of rubble, I just open up on that with clip after clip to keep your head down. That's my point. I'm not trying necessarily to hit you. I might hit you as sort of collateral damage. I might actually hit you, but really that's not the intent. The intent is just to make you lie on the floor and do nothing while my mate runs around the other end of the building and does whatever else he wants to do.
Some people have really struggled with that because, again, it's like, how can you fire? Because you're talking about the fact that actually, there is this chance you can actually hit somebody. How can you possibly hit somebody who you can't see? And there's been that sort of argument going around as well, hasn't there?
Well, there's a couple of things here. One of them is that if you look at any sort of modern small arms firing fully automatic, you can dig through walls. That is, a brick or two isn't actually that much protection against fully automatic fire, especially when you're talking about support weapons. That really you have to, you need an awful lot more substantial cover than that. And things like there was I was watching a documentary about some snipers in Iraq. And they were using Barretts with 50 cal sniper rifles to shoot people behind concrete blocks.
Yeah, they'll go straight through them. Yeah,
yeah. They worked out where they were. These guys hiding behind breeze block walls. They worked out where they were and shot them through the wall. I don't think we have much doubt that you can shoot through solid objects. And if you're clever and lucky enough, then you can work out where the target is on the other hand. And if we're talking about getting a minigun and hosing, I was watching Predator, the famous scene in Predator where they just all unload on this bit of forest. If that had been a building with somebody, a wall with somebody hiding behind it, well, I think there's a reasonable chance that they might have been damaged. And also, a friend of mine who actually saw combat said that he was cut on the face by a piece of the wall flying off and hitting him in the face. So he was injured not by the bullet itself, but by the fragments that it was kicking up because he was hitting so close. And that is another thing that could be happening here. So I think that there's although you can't see them to take a kind of aimed shot, I think if you put enough ammunition down range in their general direction, that the chances of something hitting or ricocheting off something else or going through a wall or whatever is perfectly plausible. I mean, there's another account I read where somebody was killed at a firing range, and it was a military firing range, and the guys who were holding up the little flags to show where the targets had been hit, they were in a trench by the targets that was lined with a brick wall on either side, and then against the brick wall was this great big mound of earth. So they were kind of in this sort of brick-lined trench going through a small hill, is effectively what it like. And the chap had been killed when he was sitting down, with his back leaning against the brick wall, having a cup of tea, and he was killed because a round from a 303 went through hit the brick wall, happened to hit in the mortar instead of on the brick, went through the mortar and hit him in the back. Now, I'm sure the guy wasn't aiming at him.
Indeed.
But it killed him. It killed him dead, I mean, this is like, horrible fluke accidents. But if he'd not been firing one round, if he'd been firing, like I said, he'd been firing 200 rounds of minigun at somebody he thought was in front of him, you know the guy's hiding there. You're just trying to, There's a bit in Four Brothers. This film's called Four Brothers, yes, where these guys get attacked, and the guys are basically burrowing through the brick wall with automatic weapon fire. They are literally digging through the wall with the automatic weapon fire. I mean, now that obviously it's a Hollywood movie, but I don't think that's unrealistic. You just look at a few, street scenes of Iraq and Iran after the wars they had. And, you look at Beirut, you look at, any city that's been fought over, and you see how much damage the building's fabric takes from the weapon fire. And that's, buildings get chewed up. They're not as solid as they look.
I suppose that's always the thing, isn't it? Is that people who've been playing, especially skirmish games, for so long, get this kind of feel because of the way mechanics work. They kind of get this. You suddenly start getting assumptions about how solid cover is. And
Well, the best protection is not being seen, because pretty much anything you hide behind. I mean, if you look at most modern combats these days, especially urban combats and so on, you get people clearing trenches and bunkers with anti-tank rockets. That's become. I mean, Falklands on down. That's become fairly normal proceedings. That they get issued with anti-tank weapons, and they don't happen to bump into enemy tanks, so they use them to clear bunkers.
Yes,
that's what happens when you hide in a wall behind a wall.
Indeed,
people use a milan against you.
Yeah, sorry. The reason I was laughing is as soon as you said the thing about is not being seen, I just immediately remembered a certain Monty Python sketch about the art of not being seen.
Don't pick one bush to hide behind.
Yes.
But this is it. I mean, if you pick one bush to hide behind and they've got a minigun, there won't be much left of the bush by the time they've finished with their 200-round clip, will there?
No, not at all.
So, yes, you were hiding behind a bush. So, yes, being hit by blazing away, yes, it's not terribly likely, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, but again, so we've been talking nitty-gritty mechanics and what have you here a bit, but at least it shows that these aspects are available in the game. So there is the aspect of suppression fire, and again, going back to what we were talking about earlier about teamwork, and how your forces interact together, and how they interact differently depending on what force you're playing with, and so all that's held within Deadzone, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, some people were saying, this chap's only got a weapon that can only blaze away, he can't kill people. And I go, well, you can actually do that, but it's much more difficult. But at the same point, that's not his job. That's not his role in the machine, as it were. That's not his the thing that he does. And I think it's understanding that it's that there's a variety of different roles and interlocking, working out how to interweave those those roles into a sort of military machine that achieves whatever mission you're supposed to be doing on that day. And that's the trick, isn't it? You know, if you don't like them, of course, there's plenty more different kinds of troops you can take instead.
Yes.
No shortage of different ways to blow people up.
I think we basically covered an awful lot of the basics behind the game, and you know, maybe looking a little bit at what's going to happen. I suppose ultimately, at this point in time, it's now getting the game out into the wild and seeing what the reaction was, and seeing where we are 6 months down the road. Because I mean, obviously, the beta test was appealing to a certain number of people. Now we're going to be in a situation where a whole host more people are going to be playing the game.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the beta test had a bunch of people, and everybody on the Kickstarter got a digital copy, and so that appeals to the same bunch as a few more. And then you're right. Once you know, a few weeks' time, when people get what is actually quite a ludicrously big box worth of toy soldiers, you get the next step and see what people do and how they react and so on. But I mean, at the moment, everybody's being cautiously optimistic. You never can tell, but people seem to like it. And I think it's people appreciate. I think that it has been considered. That there are reasons why stuff is the way it is, and that doesn't mean that it's perfect or there are no mistakes there. I'm sure there must be something wrong with it somewhere. But it is a certain way because we kind of sat and thought about it and scratched my head and tried to work out whether there is maybe another way of looking at this, and it's got an awful lot in it. We've crammed an enormous number of little subtleties and different sort of tactical choices and so on in it, and it will take a while to get to the bottom of all the different ways of dealing with particular problems. And I think that's what I like. I like putting lots of gameplay and stuff so you can play it lots of times. And I think it's fun because you see people get their first reaction when they look at the rules, and then they have another reaction when they play the rules for the first time, and then they get sort of an evolving. If they carry on playing, they get this sort of evolving understanding of how things fit together. And it's interesting at different stages because it's only when a game first comes out that you start getting this really clear steps in the process. In 3 years' time, if we do something new with Deadzone, some people will be new to it, some people will be playing it for 3 years, some people will be playing it for 2 years. You get a real mixed bag, and it's very hard to pick out where people are in this sort of learning process.
Yeah.
At the beginning, when there's only a handful of people who know it, and then you get this sort of the world, as it were, is going through the process much at the same time, much at the same pace. So you get this sort of quite intriguing sort of realization and learning, understanding, and people moving through this sort of learning curve almost like at the same time, almost in parallel. So yes, it will be very interesting to see what happens when it's all live. Mm-hmm. And so I expect to be answering a lot more questions on Quoteworthy about all manner of things. There's already an FAQ up. People debating interesting little details. But I think people are just waiting for their toy soldiers now. People are sort of,
Indeed, as you say, it's only discovering that we got an awful big box of stuff arriving, and
it is a very big box. I went into the office because Ronnie was saying, "Oh, it's a very big box." And I went, "Yeah, okay, fair enough." And I went in and went, "Actually, that is quite a big box for a toy soldier game. That is an impressive beast. I'm not sure how many of them I'm going to fit on my shelves. It's big. It's almost as big as the Tie Divine box, which I currently think is I'm just looking at my books here. All of my games, I think Tie Divine may be winning in terms of fatness of box at the moment, but I'm not sure. I have to put the Deadzone box up against it and see how we do. But of course, people on Kickstarter don't just get the box game; they get an outer box with a load of other stuff in it as well. Because if I understand the guys doing the packing right, that all the stuff just won't fit in the box.
Oh right, okay.
For Kickstarter people,
yes.
Kickstarter because there's so much extra stuff. It just won't fit in the normal normal trade box. It's just too much. So yes, expect a very large box of toy soldiers.
Right. Well, I'm sure I will be. I'll be talking about it in due course when my box gives a hernia to the postman when it finally turns up. Indeed.
Yeah. Fun Christmas putting things together.
Indeed, yes, very much so. Well, once again, Jake, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking time out. Having played the beta, I think I said earlier, fallen in love with the mechanics, seen where it can go and its scope outside, or hovers outside of Mantic. Suddenly looking at the rest of my, it's really inspired me for the rest of my sci-fi collection. I'm starting to look at all my cobblestone figures and various other bits and pieces, and saying, that will work in this sort of environment without having to go through an awful lot of the more complex skirmish games, and just putting it together all really appeals. So thank you for that from my point of view, because all of a sudden I suddenly see all these bits of my model collection which I can suddenly use within a single game. And of course, with the fact that you're talking about games that half the problem sometimes with people getting games together is simply it's building the environment, and it's having all the scenery there and all that sort of thing. And especially because Deadzone takes the base game is so claustrophobic, it's not difficult to put stacks of terrain in a 2x2 area and have a really good game with not a huge figure collection. So just from that sort of thing, I think it enables an awful lot of people to get into skirmish wargaming very quickly, because there are so many games which kind of say, this is kind of where you start, and you get and you get a box, and you can start the game, but it's quite limited in what it can do. And it seems with Deadzone, you get pretty much the full experience straight out of the box. And obviously you can just build it from there.
Well, thank you for that. I think, one of the things I says I do keep saying, I'm always very keen on getting as much sort of play value out of the game as I can. And when I'm designing things, I always want to put a lot in. So the idea of one of the things we talked before about the missions and so on, and because of the way that's structured, it's deliberately structured so that there's an awful lot of number of different permutations you can get to before you start repeating yourself. Which means that you can play the game and not get bored because it's the same every time. And I've got what will probably come out as another tweak at some point for it, is ways of again adding another layer to that, so we get some more bits of variation. So but yes, it's Ronnie's the champion of the scenery. He's been absolutely pushing that from day one. Wanted to do lots sooner, make sure people got lots of toys, not just toy soldiers, but environment within which they could fight. So I wanted to really make that a sort of big feature of the game. And I think it's, I've built the game around that concept. So we've got a game with scenery at the front and centre.
Really looking forward to it. So yeah, thank you very much for spending the time. And no doubt we shall speak again in the near future, and we'll catch up with where we are with with reception of Deadzone and what you've been working on and how the FAQ's been working out, and we'll obviously come back to where we're going next at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant.
Come back.
Okay, fantastic, Jake. Thank you for speaking to us again.
Cheers, Neil. Bye
bye. The Meeples Miniatures Podcast is very happy to be sponsored by Coat d'Arms Paints. Now, Coat d'Arms have been supporting miniatures painters with their products for well over 20 years in some way, shape or form. Their current range is 150 sets of acrylic paint, which are available both as individual colours but also in paint sets depending on period. Things such as the Ancients paint set, the World War II German, World War II American, World War II Russian paint sets, and they also include things like an ACW set and even a Horsetown set. That's one way to purchase your paints. And they also do triads. Now, if you're a fan of the 3-colour system, made famous by the likes of people like Kevin Dallimore, you may like to purchase your paints with a dark shade, a medium shade and a highlight. And the triad system from Coat d'Arms allows you to do this. They also have ranges of textured paints called Brushscape, which allow you to paint from textures onto bases as well as colour. And these are ideal especially for smaller scale models. And if you're a fan of the dip method of painting, then Coat d'Arms have their own product available called Super Shader. This is available in light brown, dark brown and black. Coat d'Arms paints have a whole range of products available to try. Check them out at www.blackhat.co.uk and be sure to tell them that we sent you. Since recording that show, Deadzone actually turned up on my doorstep, which I must admit quite surprised me. I think I must have been one of the first people in the country to get hold of their copy. Although I'm not feeling particularly guilty, as I think it just makes up for the fact that I was probably one of the last people to get hold of Season 3 of Dreadball. Now obviously from my conversation with Jake, you probably already know what I think of the game. I'm really impressed by it. And although the game itself has a lot of interest for me, I'm also really interested in what I can do with it outside of the immediate Mantic universe, and for actually using the Deadzone rules for playing generic hard sci-fi skirmish games. So that's kind of what I'm majoring on a lot with Deadzone. And to that extent, I'm really pleased with the rules, and I'm hoping to kind of adapt them to my own particular usage. However, what I wanted to give you a quick overview is just like what you get. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm a Kickstarter backer, so I get more than what is in the normal box. But as Jake said, it's a big box. Yes, it's a very big box. Well, it's probably about twice the size of a standard like 40k battle box sort of thing. It's as big, it's just twice as deep. So lots of stuff in it. A couple of factions, lots of scenery sprues. Obviously, as a Kickstarter, you get loads of extras. For example, we get 2 other factions, another set of scenery sprues, and a few other bits and pieces. The models are pretty nice. Obviously, we haven't seen them all yet, especially since they've been having some issues with the enforcers, so we haven't actually got proper hard plastic enforcers yet. But the other models generally seem pretty nice, and on the whole I would say they're an improvement over their Deadzone cousins. And certainly the Plague models have got some fantastic details on them. Although I'm not a huge fan of the 3rd generation Plague, the ones that can actually use weapons. The 1st and 2nd gens are really quite nice. As with Dreadball, I think the stage is stolen by the Teratons. The Teraton model is just superb. But as I say, as a general rule, the models are actually pretty good quality. I mean, one minor gripe, which I suppose has now been fixed by a Kickstarter update. But when I first got the box, there was just all these packages. There was a list of, okay, you've got 2 of package more order package A, 1 of more order package B, 1 of more order package C, for example. Okay, and you've got a list of packages that you've got, but nothing is labelled. So you have no idea at all whether you actually got the correct packages of figures or not. Now, as I say, they've since done this and put an actual list of stuff and pictures on the website. But it's something they did exactly the same with it with Dreadball, and it was just so annoying, especially like trying to sort out all the whole of Season 3 stuff with all these different packages, and especially since I had the cheerleader package, I was trying to separate everything out. Compare that to something like Empire of the Dead, for example, where you got everything blistered, everything labelled, and it was that complete dream. You just went, yeah, I've got everything, everything's here, I can see it all, it's all labelled, I know what everything is. So that was a bit of a pain, a bit of a minor niggle. Other than that, the scenery sprues themselves are really nice. They made a really good job of them. Now, I've only got the standard scenery sprues. I haven't gone for like the fortifications or the ruins. Although, having seen them, I'm seriously now considering it. They are really nice. You may have seen comments elsewhere, and yes, I don't think you get enough connectors. You get 4 or 5 sprues of scenery, and you don't get any. You only get 1 sprue of connectors to connect everything together. If you want to put as many connectors as you need to on every bit of scenery, then you probably aren't going to have enough. You can get away with using fewer, but that may affect the structural integrity of the buildings you're making. That's if you're not sticking them together. Now, one of the things with these buildings is that they're designed to pull apart and be put together in various different combinations. Whether or not you're actually going to end up doing this or not is a different matter entirely. I think there is potentially an issue with the strength of the connectors, and if you're using them to construct temporary things that you're going to pull apart and put together, rearrange in different ways, I think there is a case of sooner or later you are going to break them. There's no getting away from that. They are made to be quite a snug fit and what have you, but that does mean that sooner or later I think there's going to be breakages involved. So yes, I do think you're going to need more connectors. That said, I must admit myself personally, I think I'm just going to go and look at designing some more buildings and leaving them as is. I mean, having said that, I found a whole load of Necromunda bulkheads back in the summer, and so I've been building a whole load of various different buildings out of those, which I'm going to use for Deadzone. And so I've already got a whole host of buildings. I'm just going to use Deadzone to build a few others. And so that's what I'm going to be using my buildings, my building sprues for. I must admit the sort of arrangements that they were showing for how you can arrange a Deadzone with all the different building sprues and half walls and various other bits and pieces. And the way it looked like a cross between a shanty town and some sort of paintball or laser quest zone. That scenery has just been constructed for the sake of creating cover, as opposed to looking like anything that used to be vaguely, coherently some sort of settlement. I suppose that's an aesthetic thing, but for me, if you're fighting over what used to be a settlement, then you need to be looking at something that used to be a settlement, and not something that looks like a custom constructed arena for fighting in. Well, that's certainly my view anyway. So I will not really be using the scenery that's been provided in the same way that they have used them in some of the mock-ups. I'll be creating complete buildings. Having said all that, they are really nice. Okay, so one of the things I know from the Kickstarter was to produce all this scenery, and I would suggest that in that sense it's been a real success. Still, one of my favourite things for me are the deluxe gaming mats. They issue these 2x2 gaming mats for they had the paper one which comes with the game, and then they had these deluxe ones which are made out of like this mouse mat material. And I bought enough to make a 4x4 area to game on. Now these are colour printed on, say, something that looks like thin mouse mat material. I mean, obviously I know we discussed it during the interview, but they are really nice. The Dreadball Season 3 pitch was made out of the same sort of stuff. It's really strange. As I say, it's one of these things. It's kind of crease resistant, and you can just fold it away, what have you. Although I think it would probably be better if you ended up rolling it as opposed to folding it up. One of mine that I received was slightly creased, and I think you might need to kind of try and smooth it out a lot more to kind of get it flat. So it still might be worth rolling them as opposed to seriously just folding them up. But they are a fabulous piece of material. Now I know there's a company, I think it's Table War or something, that are currently running a Kickstarter to produce some of these similar sort of things, and what I can tell, as 6x4 gaming mats, or even 4x4 gaming mats. There's a Kickstarter for that at the moment. Looks to be very similar sort of stuff. Again, they come from China. They're really, really cool. And for me, despite all the models and all the scenery, that is a fantastic great thing about this whole thing. I bought those. Obviously, they're pre-printed with the 3x3 grid, and that now means I can use those for lots of different sizes of games, say sci-fi gaming. So I was well chuffed. Very impressed with those indeed. Card and counter quality, perfectly fine. Certainly counter quality is not up to things like Fantasy Flight standards. I queried counter quality when Dreadball came out. These aren't that much better, to be honest, as far as the counter sheets and stuff are concerned. It's a bit of a shame, but, as I say, they're perfectly serviceable. But I'm sure most people these days have lots of acrylic counters and various other bits and pieces that they could potentially use anyway. They're perfectly fine, but they're not the greatest quality in the world. The rulebook itself, really well produced, well printed, looks really nice, very succinct, straightforward, easy to read, easy to understand. So, I would say, on the whole, Deadzone is a really decent product. Certainly, if you weren't a Kickstarter follower and you just wanted to come in and buy the game from scratch, the box set, with Enforcers and Plague, plus scenery, plus a game mat, plus all your accessories, are, it's a really decent starting point. So I'd highly recommend you give it a look. It's a very good set of rules, and hopefully, you'll really enjoy it. I know I enjoyed playing the beta, and I'm looking forward to playing this a lot more in 2014. Well, that's about all we've got time for this show. Thanks once again to Jake Thornton for chatting to us about Deadzone, and thank you to yourselves for listening. I hope you found it useful, and thank you for struggling through some of the audio difficulties from Jake's interview. Well, I'll speak to you again very soon. Up until then, take care, happy gaming. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Meeples Miniatures Podcast. If you want to know more about Meeples Miniatures, there are several things you can do. First of all, you can visit the website at www.meeplesandminiatures.co.uk. If you want to contact the show at all, you can email me at neil@meeplesandminiatures.co.uk. You can follow the show on Twitter. Simply look for M&M Podcast, or click the follow us on Twitter button from the website. We also have a group on Facebook. That's the Meeples and Miniatures Podcast Fan Club. Again, follow the link from the website. And finally, if you want to help to support the show, you can always donate to the podcast by clicking the PayPal button on the donate page, again found on the website. Once again, thank you for listening. I hope you've really enjoyed the show. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.